Hello and welcome to On the Record. Last September's Hurricane Dorian struck Abaco and Grand Bahama with unprecedented force. The storm brought arguably the greatest mass casualty our country had ever experienced, with over 70 people declared dead. Last Friday in Abaco, 55 of those hurricane victims were finally laid to rest, and the response has been split. While some applauded the entities involved for the execution of the service, others were outraged about its handling and the lack of information provided beforehand. To try and bring clarity to the wider public about what took place, the Disaster Reconstruction Authority held a press conference last Sunday with key stakeholders of the burial process. But the outrage continued. Tonight on this edition of On the Record, we take a deeper dive into what occurred and why. Our topic tonight, the pursuit of closure. I'm Jerome Sawyer. Our discussion begins on the other side of this break. So the project really pays itself back.
Correct.
They set up
at the conference, the school.
As a journalist, I always have to focus on the facts, and sometimes that means going to investigate for myself. On the Record, Thursdays at 8 p.m. right here on RTV. Welcome back to On the Record. I'm your host, Jerome Sawyer. According to the Disaster Reconstruction Authority, they assumed control of the bodies of the hurricane victims sometime in February. They were tasked with ensuring a proper burial was carried out on both the islands of Abaco and Grand Bahama. Despite the burial completion last Friday, it seems as though it was just the beginning in many ways. As some of the family members and loved ones of the deceased looked on from a distance, and the wider Bahamas joined the service virtually, more and more questions surrounding the process arose. My guest for this segment of the show is a forensic pathologist that was part of that process from start to finish. She is Dr. Caryn Sands. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I do want to put in a bit of a disclaimer before we move. We extended an invitation for a representative from the Disaster Reconstruction Authority and the police force to join us for the show, but they both turned down the invitation. So, Dr. Sands, thank you again for joining us. We thought it important to have a bit of a succinct conversation about all of this. There was a press conference 2 days after the actual burial where yourself and others were able to answer questions on the media. But we wanted to have a different kind of a discussion. Same information, possibly some new information, but begin to create a bit of a storyline, if that makes sense. So let's first of all start out by talking about the role of a forensic pathologist in an instance like this.
Well, thank you for having me. And so forensic pathologists in this situation would deal with determining the cause of death after the recovery of victims in mass fatality events, which would be a large number of deceased individuals in one instance. In this case, a mass disaster or a natural disaster like Hurricane Dorian. So our job would be to examine the victims, once recovered, determine, collect information from the bodies, so basic information, male, female, quantify the remains, and the height, weight, what they're wearing, so distinctive features on the individuals. So each and every person that would have been recovered, we would have examined each and every one of them. We would attempt to determine how they may have died, and then we collect samples. So along with, we don't work alone, so there's a group of us that would work together. So myself and another pathologist, as well as my technicians and staff, we would process the victims. The police work with us, and they are responsible for photographing all of the remains. And every single person, not knowing who they were, we would collect DNA samples. Those are also given to the forensic lab for further processing. So our job is to assist with identification, quantify, and determine the cause of death in these types of instances.
If you could give us a bit of an assessment of the state of the bodies as you got into Abaco, what you found, and then in that same context, what were then the appropriate protocols?
So after the hurricane, well, I'm in New Providence, so I'll tell you that I was nervous. I didn't know what to expect. You know, on the back end of hurricanes in the region, Category 5s and the mass disasters on one island. We had 2 islands involved, and it was what, when, how are we going to get there? So we had to wait until we were able to travel and see what we could assess. So after September 1st, first I went to Grand Bahama. So the weekend after, I was able to go to Grand Bahama and assist Grand Bahama with some of their victims. And then once we were able to get to, and they were decomposing, so not well preserved like you would normally see somebody who had just died, had just passed. So
the decomposition was rapid.
So decomposition happens soon after death. And obviously, if you cannot store someone within a certain amount of time, you're going to start to decompose. And the first things that start to happen are green discoloration, and it's a matter of bacteria. So, I mean, just to be frank, that's why it happens. So you have variables like heat and other things that are going to cause it to go.
Salt water as well, I would imagine.
Yes, which is a whole other factor. So you have all these variables that can accelerate decomposition, but what you want to try and do is slow it down. So it's very important to get storage immediately and as quickly as possible. So given power and all these other things that you have to take into effect, we finally got storage in Grand Bahama and then ultimately in Abaco. Now, they do have refrigerated storage coolers in the clinic that can accommodate 4 to 6 individuals.
This was in Abaco?
This is in Abaco. So
I'm sure that filled up very quickly.
So it was full. When I got there, when I was able to travel, we were able to travel on the 10th of September when it was safe to get in. So that's 9 days out.
Wow.
And there were victims in the more clinic cooler. They were well preserved to just maybe early decompositional changes, so just some green discoloration, perhaps some bloating changes, which is part of the sequence. I think, you know, they had problems with maintaining the power. So that, you know, you have
you just had a category 5. So
yeah, you just had a category 5. So part of my the urgency was also the numbers, because we had no idea what to expect. It's massive. It could have been no one recovered at that time to up to who knows. But when we got there, I was able to examine 5 people that can be visually identified. So that is one way that they could have been identified by their face, because they were well preserved. In the cooler, however, when I went, these are now the people in the morgue. In the trailer, there were 27 victims in the trailer by that time. So within 9 days, 27 plus 5, we had been recovered. So obviously I was there by myself in the first instance, and I could not handle the 27 in the trailer. I did do an inspection of the condition of the victims, and at that time I thought that when I get the team together, we're going to have to go with DNA. We'll take photographs, but my impression of the state of decomposition from decomposed badly decomposed. So the facial recognition, in my opinion, was not possible to skeleton. So when I say skeleton, that's no skin, right? No skin on the bones. So you can't tell who that is. You're going to have to go to DNA retrieval. We went shortly after that. The team went within, I think, on the 12th. So only a couple of days later to start the processing of those remains in the trailer.
Of the remains, did people have personal identification on them, IDs, things of that nature? And I also want to talk in that context about fingerprints. Were you able to,
Sure.
to get fingerprints and even dental work at that point?
So the fingerprints would be a definitive identification, as a mode of definitive identification. And I don't take the fingerprints. The police would attempt to take fingerprints. Again, given the condition, I think that probably hampered the retrieval of fingerprints. I understand that it was done. They may not have gotten any matches, or they weren't successful in actually getting good print quality. I don't know the details about the prints. Of course, with dental examination, we would have to have access to a forensic odontologist, ideally, who can look at teeth. But of course, we would also have to have ante-mortem dental X-rays to compare. If you have access to that, then of course we can go ahead and do dentistry. I
wonder, before we tell us about what then happened with the extraction of the DNA, what happened in that instance, and how was that handled, and even where we are with that at this point.
Okay. So I'm going to start at the back of that question. So where we are with the DNA is that we have no profiles, as I understand, from the DNA that was submitted. Going back to it, each and every time we examined the bodies. Remember, you had 55 that were buried, but we didn't get 55 at once.
Sure.
So we had to make multiple trips. In total, we went 6 times to Abaco, and each and every time they were examined, and DNA was taken from every set of new recovered victims.
So you're taking every time you go, there may be new victims?
Ongoing,
okay.
Correct. So it is an ongoing process. Now, the analysis or the attempts to get the DNA did not, well, first of all, they were retrieved. They're submitted over, and it's a chain of custody process. So they have to go to the police lab, and then they are submitted to a reference laboratory out stateside. And that process, of course, I don't know when they went over from when we submitted them, for example. Like if we took them on the 12th, I don't know when those specimens would have left.
Gone to the US.
So I don't know that answer. We were, again, there's the rapid DNA identification or profiles. This is a hot topic now. They used it for the California burn victims last year. I mean, you could get a DNA profile in a day or 2 days. So we were attempting to do that. Our tissue, I think that we submitted at first, was not adequate. We went back just to get tissue so that we could try and get this
so additional DNA
to try and get something quickly. Because standard DNA retrieval, especially if we're looking at taking teeth and all of that, it takes a while. It's not like on TV.
CSI situation.
No, I always say it doesn't happen in an hour.
All right.
Doesn't happen in an hour. It takes time. And then there is the issue of getting the specimens to the laboratory. I didn't answer your question about the IDs. You asked me that,
yes.
And yes, there were victims that had identification cards in their wallets and on their person, yes. If I recall, maybe about seven or so people had some form of national insurance card, that sort of thing.
We're going to take a quick break and come back. Stay with us. You're watching On the Record. We're going to be back right after this. welcome to On the Record.
Looking for more On the Record? If you miss our Thursday showing at 8 p.m., join us for the re-airing on Friday mornings at 10, and then again each Sunday night at 8:30. Or go to our YouTube channel and catch up on all of our past episodes. And then like our Facebook and Instagram pages for a preview of upcoming shows and get a chance to ask your questions. Just look for On the Record.
Welcome back to this edition of On the Record. My guest is the forensic pathologist who's been a part of the process in burying the victims of Hurricane Dorian. She is Dr. Caryn Sands. Dr. Sands, in the news conference over the weekend, it was revealed that you needed matching DNA, so to speak, and it should come from a relative on the mother's side. Why is that important?
Yes, we inherit our DNA from our father and our mother, but depending on, especially in these situations when the condition of the specimen is so degraded, sometimes you have to rely on mitochondrial DNA, which is a little more intense, but it's only inherited from your mother.
So that's why it's important for them to come.
Yes,
okay.
so that's what I believe, yeah.
We learned on Sunday that from the police force that 63 bodies were recovered in Abaco. There were only 33 reports of individuals missing. Why is it so important for the DNA to be used and to make these definitive matches? Because as we went to the break, we talked about IDs and different things that were found on people. If you find my body somewhere or in a condition like this, why can't you just say, hey, this is Jerome Sawyer, he had his ID?
So it's a presumptive identification. I feel that we probably can say, and as a matter of fact, some of the death certificates are signed as presumed to be.
Okay.
Given the identification that was in their possession. But I could give you an example. We had a body that had 2 different IDs. So maybe he was carrying the ID for his child or his brother with him. I give you everything to hold.
Right.
So, like you try to understand the circumstances, but not knowing who the person is, I couldn't say he was one or the other. So we have to be careful with that type of situation. But a single ID on a person, or in some instances, we did have cases where they had more than one of the same ID.
We're going to talk to the coroner on another segment, but those 55 who were buried did not represent all of the individuals who died. Some bodies were released, correct?
Yes.
And that process would have happened because?
So the few that I mentioned in the beginning that were well preserved, visual ID.
Okay.
They were able to be, you could look at them, their relatives could say that was my son, brother. Correct.
I can definitively say I can recognize this.
Yeah.
And these were the bodies that were not so badly decomposed.
Correct.
Okay. You spoke also of we learned of the categories of the conditions of bodies: well preserved, skeletonized, and body parts. Explain the differences, and for the most part, what condition would those bodies have been in that were buried on Friday?
They weren't well preserved. So I can eliminate with confidence that they were not well preserved victims. They would fall into the other categories. They were decomposed to skeletal remains, partial remains. So even if you had a partial skeleton, or maybe just a skull and a forearm, those type of. And each person is, each body part is one victim. So if we received or a skull was recovered, that is one person.
Wow. And that
That is that is one person.
So and I hate to be so graphic, that skull could be inside one of those caskets.
Yes.
That was laid
Correct.
to rest on Friday. Wow. It's a question I have to ask. I mean, why has the DNA taken so long to match? I think that's what a lot of I already see you said, but people are asking, well, why is it taking so long? Why? But, you know, from a scientific perspective, if you could just help us to understand, you know, why these things take so long. And I guess it's because, you're right, we watch CSI. So in an hour, we're able to, watching television, rationalize that a body is found, and by the end of the show, they know who it is, and someone's going to court for the crime. But, you know, in this instance, you know, help us to understand, particularly for the families, why this process has taken so long.
I wish I could answer the why. I know it's not straightforward. I know, like I mentioned, if it is mitochondrial DNA, that is a slightly more tedious process than a regular profile. So I imagine this might be one of the reasons why they might be having trouble. However, that is just me speculating. I don't. I can't
understand
tell you.
that's not clearly your area, and I guess the point of all of it is, you know, people want to understand, you know, or I want people to understand, or help people to understand that it's not a situation where, you know, it happens right away and it happens, you know, overnight. Yeah.
You know, we're dealing with outside laboratories, reference laboratories that probably are inundated with a lot of other samples that they have to process.
It doesn't help that we're in the COVID-19.
No, that doesn't help, and I don't know where their priorities lie.
Sure.
So it might not be us. And so we're at the back of the line, maybe.
Heaven forbid something like this were to happen again anytime soon. Do you think from a just lessons learned perspective, you and your team do you think you're a little better equipped or able to handle something like this were to happen again? Would you do things differently?
The Bahamas is so unique, so this can happen on any island in the Bahamas, right? So what we did, I think, was what we were supposed to do.
Right.
A lot, as far as I'm concerned.
Okay.
And I think we did our job with the 55 that were buried. Had it been more, we would have definitely, and we did have people asking how much help we needed. So, I mean, right away, but we didn't know what we had. So we had to see what we could do. And 55, not all at once, mind you, in segments, we were able to handle and process and do what we, from my perspective, on our end. God forbid this doesn't happen again. I really hope it doesn't. But I think we know that we have to have certain things in place so that perhaps we're on the ground sooner. But I don't know what we could have done given the destruction to get there, because we got there as fast as we could, and I thought it was,
You know, and I think sometimes maybe we forget, you know, you put in context, you had airports that weren't open right away.
Right.
You had the living that you had to deal with and getting a lot of them out and getting in.
Right, which is always the first thing that you have to do when you have a mass disaster. When you have a disaster, you have to deal with the casualties first. You deal with the sick and the survivors. And then we talk about recovery and identification and all of that. So we're at the end of that first line. So the living really have to be dealt with before I come in.
I've got to ask, what was it like emotionally, though, for you and your team having to go in and having to deal with that so many times? And, you know, you're right there dealing with this and such a big tragedy.
Yeah. It is hard. And, like, you know, like I say, it's my Bahamas, my people. I feel like I have to do what I can. For those that can't speak for themselves, can't say, can't do, so we had to be there. It is overwhelming when you stand back and look at just the number. Like, you know, you think, oh, 55, and you look, oh, it's a small number, but, you know, you think about a high school class or two classes together. Could you imagine all of those people? Yeah. It's a lot of people. And each one has families. They all have families that, you know, so I feel for that, and each time. We don't take it lightly, and we try to do the best we can. So it was hard.
Was there a difference between the preservation of bodies, and I think you mentioned it earlier, in Grand Bahama and Abaco? Grand Bahama, of course, larger population, have their own hospital, etc. Probably a little better equipped, but was there a big a noticeable difference, particularly in the preservation part? You mentioned a couple bodies being in the clinic in Abaco, but from a professional standpoint, you know, having people on the ground to do this kind of work.
So what I recognized in Grand Bahama, and I take this opportunity to say congratulations to Dr. Pettikin, because she's the forensic pathologist in Grand Bahama, and I went to assist her. She's the only one there. Well, herself, yeah, because she was on the ground. The other pathologist was not there. But the issue that they had was power and refrigeration. Mm-hmm. So bodies prior to the storm were decomposing.
Wow.
So we had to try and deal with and examine the bodies prior to the storm as well as the incoming. She had a refrigerated trailer that needed to be fired up, just like you should, not knowing what she would have expected either. So her bodies were not unrecognizable, but they were in decomposition states.
Dr. Sands, I want to thank you for coming on and sharing this with us. I think we, at least from where I sit, been able to understand, you know, the perspective a lot better. Hopefully, you know, we are able to help to bring a little bit more understanding to it. It doesn't ease the pain, I think, for the family members in the least bit. I can only sympathize with them, not empathize. I'm not completely connected. But when we look at, you know, where we are in all of this, you know, it continues to be a heartbreak, you know, for people who cannot have the remains of their loved ones. But, you know, as we close, I just want to, you know, thank you and your team for the work that you did in bringing us to this point. I think sometimes we don't understand the work that's happening behind the scenes and the things that we don't see. So we appreciate the work that you and your team have done. And thank you so much, because we all have a role to play in a disaster like this. So thank you very much for coming on.
Pleasure.
All right, stay with us. On the Record, we'll continue our discussion. We've got lots more to talk about. That discussion continues right after this break. Hello and welcome to On the Record, and the balanced, true and open debate you've been looking for. Welcome back to this edition of On the Record, the pursuit of closure. This segment is made possible by Executive Printers. Unlike other jurisdictions around the world, the coroner of the Bahamas is not a medical doctor, and her role is strictly legal. With Hurricane Dorian bringing the Bahamas its first mass casualty, at least on this level, the role of the coroner became even more necessary, but also raised the question of what exactly is the coroner's role, at least from our perspective. My guest for this segment of the show is none other than Coroner Jeanine Weech-Gomez. Welcome to On the Record. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Mr. Sawyer, and thank you for having me.
Let's start out by understanding what the role of the coroner really entails. I think, you know, I referenced somebody a few days ago when we were putting together the show. Growing up, we used to watch Quincy on television, and he was the coroner. And exactly. In our minds, I think we sort of thought that's what a coroner does. But explain to us what the role of the coroner is in an instance like this.
Well, as you said, the role of the coroner in this jurisdiction is very much unlike Quincy. That role is played in this jurisdiction by the pathologist, not the coroner. And our role is a legal one. As a coroner, there's one coroner and 7 deputies. We are all stipend and circuit magistrates. So it's a statutory role, like you said, a legal one, so we're subject to an act as the coroner. My mandate pretty much is the Coroner's Act of 2011. The role is a legal one in that I deal with the issue of releases of bodies, identifying of bodies, and thereafter releasing them. And there are some instances when the Act specifies that inquiries must be done. Example, and perhaps a more popular one, is that of police shootings or deaths in popular ones, police shootings or deaths in police custody. It's mandated under the Act that inquests be held in those instances. In all the other instances, a decision is made based on an inquiry as to whether or not an inquest must be held.
In a situation like this, we've had a hurricane, we have mass casualties, still, uncertainty even how many.
Right.
What was your, or continues to be your role in this instance?
As you will appreciate, Dorian really was classified as a major disaster. So in order to do my job effectively and efficiently, I had to work with a number of agencies. And in almost every case, I worked very closely with the pathologist and the police before I could do my job, because really and truly the coroner doesn't come into play in the Commonwealth of the Bahamas unless and until the death is reported to me. In the situation like Dorian, I heard just as you, well, perhaps not as you would have heard as a reporter, but certainly from the outside looking in, of the disaster Dorian did, in particular in Abaco and Grand Bahama. So we knew immediately that there was going to be work to be done. But how this work was going to be done in the circumstances would have depended on how many deaths, certainly from a coroner's perspective, on how many deaths there were. Once we found out that there were a huge number of deaths, we became involved through the police information from the police and the pathologists. So my role then was to ensure that proper mortuary facilities were in place, continuity of the evidence, identification of bodies. So I had the task of trying to ensure and liaise with the morgue that we have proper facilities to store bodies. And initially, these 55 bodies that were buried last week Friday, when the news came, we didn't have 55. They came incrementally. So when we started, I think when we got down to Abaco, there were 5. Before the end of that day, bodies had been brought in and we were up to over 20. So we knew immediately, well, even before going down from what we had been hearing, that we were going to require additional mortuary, an additional facility to store bodies because of the capacity of the morgue in Grand Bahama, and not only Grand Bahama, but the morgue in Abaco as well. So that was the first issue that, as the coroner and the pathologist, we had to put our heads together to deal with. How are we going to preserve what bodies are retrieved? And certainly from where I sit, the removal and recovery of these bodies were very important, because that would be a part of our collection to be able, if at all, to do proper identifications in order to release.
How did we then get to determining and issuing death certificates? Okay. From this point now, you're on the ground, you've been able to determine how these bodies are being kept.
Yeah.
And how do you now get to the stage of issuing a death certificate?
Once the pathologist examines and in some instances, when necessary, does a post-mortem, death certificates could be issued. Now, in this instance, because the bodies were, I think we may have had 2 or 3 presumptive death certificates. And what do I mean by presumptive death certificates? Where the deceased is presumed to be John Doe. So there may have been 2 or 3 presumptive death certificates, but all the other death certificates, which isn't unusual if we do not have an identity, a death certificate could be issued, but we have to wait for the identity of the person in order to give it, to identify and put a name on the death certificate. We got to that point once the pathologist, Dr. Sands and Bridgewater, was satisfied that they were able to sign off on a death certificate saying that the cause of death was drowning in most cases due to the effects of Hurricane Dorian.
And if I could, but in most instances, the death certificate requires a name and identification.
Well, the death certificate does require a name and an identification if you have it. But death certificates can and are issued in unidentified black male, white male, etc. If we don't have it, as in this instance, we're waiting for DNA evidence in order to properly identify. When once that is done, the death certificates could then be remedied to have the person's name and date of birth and all the other relevant particulars that you would see on a death certificate.
But you do need a death certificate to inter a body, correct?
You do need a death certificate to inter.
Okay. And if you could also explain to us the process of the inquest now. I think there are 5 areas of inquest. And could you explain to us?
There are. Under the Act, there are 5 questions that we seek to determine in an inquest. And the first question, of course, is who died, where and when they died, the circumstances surrounding the death. And those are the questions that we asked or tried to determine on the cause of death during the course of the inquest. Sometimes we are able to identify answer all those questions. Unfortunately, sometimes we are not. And it's not always that an inquest is necessary. Based on information, we may determine that we do not need, the public won't be better served by an inquest, because that is one of the things that we also look at. Will the public be better served by doing an inquest?
What does that mean, that the public won't be better served?
Nothing new will come out.
Okay.
Nothing new will come out. We can't learn anything from it. Then you make a decision that no further information could be had that would be helpful in the circumstances. Unlike Dorian, however, we do intend to conduct an inquest, because the problem is that there is still a lot of missing and presumed dead. So families aren't not only, whilst death certificates would have been signed for the 55 bodies that were interred last week, there are some family members that may not be successful with DNA evidence. Because as you would have perhaps appreciated on Sunday, there are a lot of challenges with the identifications. So we will have to do an inquest to determine missing and presumed dead. It is only when once that inquest is held that families can then be issued death certificates on the strength of a verdict of the inquest that speaks to a loved one being missing and presumed dead.
So then that will help them,
That will then assist the Registrar General in issuing a death certificate, because then we will have names on the verdicts.
And so that will speak to then declaring people legally dead.
Legally dead, yes.
Okay.
And there's been a lot of, I would say, for a better word, noise in the marketplace about the 7 years. But the Act does give the coroner jurisdiction to hold an inquest and make a declaration well under the 7 years. And when, to declare someone missing.
When do we think that inquest could begin? And any idea about how long that might take?
I would like to say to you, I would have liked for the inquest to have begun weeks after Dorian, but that's a very perfect world. The issue has been we have bodies that are yet to be identified. We're still waiting for DNA evidence, which is a very lengthy process. Generally, DNA evidence in this jurisdiction takes anywhere from 6 to 9 months. before it comes back. So that has really been a challenge for us in declaring missing and persons missing and presumed dead. When you have bodies that are still yet to be identified, we're still asking for persons that have loved ones that are missing to come forward to give DNA evidence so the testing could be done in relation to bodies, and it's an ongoing exercise. We are ready, willing, and able to conduct the inquest as soon as reasonably practical. Once I am satisfied from the police missing and presumed missing list, we are prepared to commence the inquest. As to whether or not the inquest will take, how long it will take, as long as we need to, because we will give it priority. I appreciate the stress that this has caused a lot of people. I know that people want to get on with their lives. They want to know what's happened. And of course, there are issues for some people as it relates to insurances, etc. So I'm very conscious of that. We all are.
It's interesting you brought up insurance, because I guess if I'm a family member and somebody has passed away, I can't get them declared legally dead. It affects the insurance premium.
It certainly does.
Do I continue to pay? What does the law say to that? I mean, does that? I'm just curious as to if there is an answer at this point.
Well, Jerome, I can't say to you. What I will say to you is generally people have been advised to continue to pay unless and until the death certificate is issued.
Okay. Well, I mean, that's fair enough. Coroner Gomez, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
It's rare that we get an opportunity
it is very, very rare.
to speak to a coroner
in
an instance like this, but thank you.
But we thought it, given all the circumstances, we thought it would be helpful to try to bring some clarity for people, because I think the roles, as you said when you started, the role of the coroner in this jurisdiction is sometimes very confusing for people.
Yes.
So I thank you, and again I wish to offer my heartfelt condolences to the families of all those in the Dorian hurricane.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the work that you and your team are doing
Thank you.
in all of this. It is difficult work, and thank you. And we certainly will be watching for that, you know, the inquest to take place, and hopefully bring that much-needed closure.
And we're hopeful that it will be done relatively soon now. Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming on. Stay with us. Our
Thank you.
show continues. Our final segment is still to come. Stay with us.
Matt, where in the world is Matt Lauer? Where in the world is Alison Greenslade? And so it's about the low value of cottage in Atlanta. So we can talk about it.
On the record tonight, the government's purchase of the Grand Bouquin is a hot subject in the news. Welcome back. You're watching On the Record, The Pursuit of Closure. This final segment is brought to you by private business contractors. While the roles of the pathologist and coroner were vital for the burial of those 55 people lost during Hurricane Dorian, one thing is undeniable: none of it would be possible without morticians. From the collection of bodies to the preparation and lowering of caskets and sealing of graves, skilled workmen are to ensure a smooth burial process, well, as much as possible. My guest for this segment is the president of the United Funeral Homes and Morticians Association, Mr. Kirsch Ferguson. Thank you so much for taking time out and being with us on this segment. Let's talk about what went into preserving those bodies and body parts, as we were told, for burial. 9 months, just about after a hurricane and deaths, you are burying bodies. What went into that process?
Once again, thank you, Jerome, for having me. In the first instance, just as Dr. Sands alluded to, those bodies were in various stages of decomposition. Our primary role in retrieving those bodies from the cooler was to, first of all, ensure that we follow the numbering system that was instituted by the pathologist, and then to apply a topical embalming powder onto the bodies. It was a pyroformaldehyde-based substance that was used to, one, inhibit odors, and at the same time to help preserve what was in those body bags.
Okay. And this was a coalition of funeral homes and funeral directors. You all
That is correct.
All had a part in this.
Yes.
How were you selected to be a part of this? I mean, how, because there's been some controversy about you know, the burial of these bodies, but how is it that you all came to be involved in this?
In the first instance, the association is made up of about 19 member firms throughout the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. When we were advised of the possibility of a burial taking place for the Dorian victims, we were invited to submit a bid to the Bahamas government.
As a group?
Yes, as an association, as a group. Once we would have been selected by the DRA, we invited all of our member firms to a meeting where it was revealed that we were given instructions to participate in the burial of the victims of Dorian. A total of about 9 firms agreed to come on board to assist in this endeavor, and that is how we got to where we came to on Friday of last week.
The Disaster Reconstruction Authority Deputy Chairman Algernon Cargill is quoted in giving the cost for these burials at $360,000, which included graveside and burial preparation, and in some instances actual recovery of the dead. Tell us how do you justify a cost like that? How did we get to that cost? A lot of people have said, well, that seems really high, but you know, from a mortician's perspective, how did you get to a place where 55 burials would cost $360,000?
I think the simplest way to answer that, if you take it from the aspect of a traditional funeral, there are 2 cost factors in funeral planning. One, the service of the funeral director, and then your disbursements or non-charges of the funeral home. The non-charges would be primarily your grave, announcements, and the like. In this instance, the grave itself, and then also the logistics of the caskets and the like. Our primary service as morticians was simply the casketing and our professional fees for the bodies. So the government was presented with a proposal that outlined the face value of these items and then our costs to produce or provide the service. Yes.
And is that pretty normal in terms of the costing for something like that?
Yes, it is. It is.
Okay. There were special 20-gauge sealed caskets. I can't pronounce the correct name. Why was it necessary to use these types of caskets, and was the cost different from we could call it a regular casket?
Hermetically sealed is the word you're looking for.
Hermetically sealed,
yes.
Thank you. Okay.
The decision to use those type caskets, one, primarily, they are sealed caskets that inhibits the release of odors from what's inside the casket. There was concern of the water table, of course, in the area as well. And then 2, it's an added protection. In most cases, primarily in the US, it's a matter of peace of mind. It is not something that's mandated here in the Bahamas, but given the particular circumstances, we thought it best to go with that route. Yes, there is a cost difference compared to what is called a non-sealer casket. In this instance, because there was a bulk rate or a bulk purchase by the association, we got a comparatively reasonable cost on purchasing those units. So the government did not have to exceed an absorbent amount to facilitate using a sealer casket.
And what's the benefit? I mean, you mentioned some of that, but is there a benefit to those caskets in the event that they need to be reopened at any point, if the bodies have to be exhumed for any point?
There is a warranty attached to such caskets. However, nothing man-made is guaranteed forever. Part of the comfort or peace of mind with those caskets, DNA is still ongoing, the processing. Let's say in 5, 10 years, there may be a claim that someone is being positively identified. I'm just using that figure arbitrarily. The fact that casket can be retrieved out of the earth and the casket can be reopened, not guarantee that something will still be there, but the fact that every effort was made to preserve that body in such a state that the family has a peace of mind to exhume the body and have the casket interred to some place that they would like it to be.
So there is a higher probability of the preservation?
There is a high probability, but be mindful now, those bodies were already in a state of decomposition. We made every effort to apply the proper topical embalming powders to those bodies to assist in preserving what is there. Yeah.
We saw a video of individuals who were there trying to lower a casket into one of the graves,
Yes.
met with some difficulty, even sort of stomping on the casket at some
Yes.
point. It's caused a lot of anxiety. You know, how do you respond to something like that? Is that something that can happen normally? I'm just asking. I mean, it seemed...
Things like that.
It shocked me when I saw it.
Yeah, it did. It did. I think the entire nation was shocked when they saw it. In the first instance, let's deal with the situation of difficulty of lowering the casket. You can remember now, some of these caskets had full intact bodies. Some of these caskets had a body limb that had to be classified as an individual and placed in a casket. I think in the first instance with one of those caskets being lowered, that may have been one of the units that had a body limb in it. Therefore, there was a miscalculation on the weight, and hence you saw the casket one end going down quicker than the next. Secondly, in one instance, I think that was captured on camera, one of the morticians actually lost his footing while on the edge of the grave, and it gave the visual appeal as if he was actually stamping or pressing down on the casket. I was not immediately at that site, but at the same time, in hearing the story,
it seemed like it was stuck and they were trying to move it down.
Exactly, yes. When I saw the
footage, he applied
footage,
his foot on it.
Yes, yes. So I think in that instance, even though he lost his footing, probably a knee-jerk reaction to do what he did happen, but at the same time, it should have never happened. And I do humbly apologize from the association for that being captured in that manner.
You know, I know from personal experience that, you know, dealing with one funeral can be a daunting task. But what was it like having to bury now 55 people in the same day over the same period of time? 55 coffins had to be lowered without the normal mechanisms that you all use.
Well, before we get to the interment service of it, just the sheer fact of us having to go into that cooler to retrieve those bodies and have those casketed was very heart-wrenching for most of us. The numbers was one thing, but the state of those bodies was another. Then the manual lifting of those caskets from off the compound of the clinic onto trucks to the cemetery and then loading to the cemetery. The actual lowering of those caskets was physically exhausting from start to finish. And it was something that none of us, I think, will ever forget, based on the fact that while we encountered some difficulties, at the same time, we were mindful that we were serving a community and serving a nation. And we had to be very mindful of all that we was doing at that moment in time.
Do you think anything could have been done differently in this entire process that would have not made it so contentious for so many people?
In hindsight, I honestly think yes, but the reality is that what was done by the Bahamas government was done in decency and good order. Even the contracting of our services was done to uphold what they envisioned at the end of the day. I think some of the detractors had the contract gone the other way. I don't think much of the noise in the market would have been happening. So we are mindful and grateful that what happened for the best interest of this nation, and at the same time, to hope to bring closure to these families.
Any concerns about, you know, just sort of leaving them in that trailer for this period? I think a question on a lot of our minds is why this rush, why now, when they've been sitting there almost 9 months?
Well, in terms of the rush, I cannot specifically speak to that. I know that we were given instructions based on a time frame, and we had to abide by that. So that's the only thing I can really speak to.
Mr. Ferguson, thank you so very much. Thank you for coming on. We appreciate you and all of our previous guests. That's going to do it for tonight's episode of On the Record, The Pursuit of Closure. While we know that there is nothing we can ever say that will comfort the hearts of the loved ones of the deceased, we want you to know that you are forever in our thoughts. I wish to thank my guests, Dr. Caryn Sands, our Coroner Gomez, and Mr. Ferguson for being with us tonight, as well as to our production and technical teams for producing this show weekly. Of course, to you, our viewers, a very special thank you. Look forward to seeing you next time, same place, same time, right here on The Record.